A beautiful weekend to you all, our amazing viewers. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Let's take a look at the stories dominating today's newspaper headlines. First, we'll start from the Guardian newspaper. On the Guardian newspaper on page 6, which is boldly written, high cost of hepatitis care, stressed facilities exposed 20 million to liver damage. Senate expand oil sector probe to agencies firms over 90s audit findings. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. Oyedele explains how Nigerians spent FX subsidy removal savings. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Federal government ends daily fuel, says no petrol above 50 ppm in Nigeria. To read more on that headlines, you go to page 5 of the newspaper. I'm still on page 5. Federal government adopts household mapping to tackle 15 million out of school children. To read more on that story, go to page 5 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper on page 2, which is written there boldly on Oyo adoption. Why we tracked arrested kidnappers' families. This is coming from our President Bola Ahmed Tinubu concerning the Oyo school children adoption and teachers, and he's saying why they tracked an arrested kidnapper's family. To know more about that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. Osun 2026, Adeleke Oyebamije signed peace pact as INEC warns troublemakers. To read more on that headlines, you go to page 16 of the newspaper. And on page 20 of the newspaper, drug trafficking in Africa jumps 6-fold in 2 years. This is coming from the Africom. They are saying how drug trafficking in Africa has increased drastically. To read more on that, you go to page 20 of the Punch newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent. On the Daily Independent, which is written there, cotton textile revival may boast job surge, FX stability. And at the top of the newspaper, which is written, military deployment in elections shouldn't be routine. This is coming from the INEC chairman saying that military deployment in elections shouldn't be a routine thing, like it shouldn't be something that will be changing every single time. Osun people won't be intimidated ahead of Guba pills. To read more on that, you go to page 4 of the newspaper, and the Osun people won't be intimidated ahead of Guba pills. This is coming from Adeleke. And on page 7, resident doctors threaten nationwide strike over unpaid salary welfare. To know more about resident doctor, why they are threatening nationwide strike over unpaid salaries, you go to page 7 of the Daily Independent newspaper. And on page 6, Nigeria laying foundation for $1 trillion economic. This is coming from the federal government. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Why we zeroed out ransom in Oriri kidnap rescued by Tinubu. To read more on that headline, you go to page 29 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard newspaper. On the Vanguard newspaper on page 5, which is boldly written there, federal government labor clash over use of fuel subsidy removal savings. This is coming from the federal government saying how labor clashed over use of fuel subsidy removal savings. To read more on that, you go to page 5. Nigeria, other African countries face 6-fold security threats in 2 years. This is coming from US Africom saying how Nigeria and other African countries are facing 6-fold security threats in just 2 years. To read more on that headline, you go to page 9 of the Vanguard newspaper. And this is from Oriri. Why we refuse to negotiate with terrorists. Okay, this is coming from President Tinubu concerning the Oriri school children kidnap. And he's saying that why they refuse to negotiate with terrorists. If you want to know why they refuse to negotiate with terrorists, to read more on that, you go to page 8 and 12 of the Vanguard newspaper. And on page 19, menace of open defecation, Nigerian silent sanitation emergency. To read more on that, you go to page 19 of the newspaper. And on page 6, Nigeria mourns ex-finance minister Abubakar Alhaji. Landing on Delta Road, aircraft crew still in DSS detention. This is coming from Kiyamo. To read more on that, you go to page 32 of the Vanguard newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust newspaper. On the Daily Trust newspaper on End Bad Governance protest, victims' families await compensation 2 years after. To read more on that, you go to page 3 and 4 of the newspaper. Stop building flyovers, Tinubu tells governors. This is coming from our President Bola Ahmed Tinubu to state governors. He's telling them that they should stop building flyovers. To read more on that, you go to page 7 of the newspaper. And on page 6 of the newspaper, 2027, INEC rejects routine deployment of soldiers during elections. Otedola raises stake at First Holdco to 25.87%. To read more on that, go to page 19 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor on insecurity, which is boldly written, federal government won't negotiate with criminals, says Tinubu. This is coming from President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, saying that federal government will not be negotiating with criminals. And on 2027, military vows commitment to neutrality in elections. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. Then on Oriri saga, Makinde constitutes judicial panel to probe children, teachers, adoption. To read more on that headline, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. And on page 3, which is on World Trafficking Day, NAFDAC warns job seekers to verify employment offers. To read more on that headline, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. And still on page 3 of the newspaper, FCCPC engages NERC state electricity regulations on consumer protection and cooperation. And still on page 3 of the Daily Monitor newspaper, man seeks tax humanization, better infrastructure to boost manufacturing. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the Daily Monitor newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the First Daily newspaper. On the First Daily newspaper, which is written on no ransom for terrorists. This is coming from Tinubu. Tinubu reaffirms hardline stance against kidnappers. President Tinubu is still reaffirming about no ransom for terrorists. Otedola raises First Holdco stake to 25.88% in 222 billion naira deal. And still in the same newspaper, residents risk leave scooping fall from leaking tanker in Delta. Still another headline, police arrest barber over alleged ritual use of customers' hair. To know more about that, on police arresting barber over alleged ritual use of customers' hair, go to First Daily newspaper. NAFDAC seeks 5,000 more staff to strengthen regulation. So the NAFDAC are seeking 5,000 more staff to strengthen their regulation. And still in the same newspaper, FCCPC warns against 36 different power regulation. FCCPC are warning against 36 different power regulation. Away from that newspaper to the last newspaper of today, which is the Matrix newspaper. On the Matrix newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written on insecurity, still President Tinubu saying that we won't pay terrorists ransom. Tinubu talks tough. Osun decides we won't allow fear force to determine pool, says INEC. This is coming from the INEC on Osun decide. They are saying that they won't allow fear force to determine the pool. And still in the same newspaper on page 3, federal government to publish detailed reports on fuel subsidy savings utilization. To read more of that, you go to page 3 of the Matrix newspaper. And on page 9 of the Matrix newspaper, Tinubu scraps presidential committee on sale of federal assets, hands oversight to AGF. To read more on that, you go to page 9 of the newspaper. And on page 2, indefinite nationwide strike looms as doctors give federal government 10 days ultimatum. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. And still on Matrix newspaper on entertainment, Arya Star recuperating after complicated surgery. So the popular Nigerian musician Arya Star is recuperating his recovery after a complicated surgery. To read more on that, you go to page 23 of the newspaper. Still on Matrix newspaper on sports, World Cup, UEFA threatens boycotts over FIFA's controversial private investment plan. To read more on that, go to page 25 of the Matrix newspaper. And on page 26 of the newspaper, which is the last headline, China raises fresh trade concerns with US over new restrictions. To read more on that, you go to page 26 of the Matrix newspaper. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Esom. Do have a beautiful weekend.